My work today in 2024 is hands down fundamentally different than what I was doing in 2015 or 2016, et cetera. You might call it marketing, you might call it content marketing, you might even call it content strategy or content operations, or, there's lots of different terms being bandied about. But the work is fundamentally different, but it changes, it evolves. It's sort of the old, I think it was Madonna that actually talked about way back in the day, talking about the evolution, you just sort of change with the times and you evolve with the times, and you are fundamentally different 10 years later, but it didn't come in a giant pivot. It came over sort of small incremental changes that happen over the decade. Marketing is and always has been a balance of art and science. And the artistic part is literally emotional, contextual, artistic, creative. You just can't predict it. It will ultimately be something that resonates or doesn't based on so many fundamental things that you can't ever predict it scientifically. And so you have to balance those things. And so they're not in tension with each other, but they are in balance with each other. And so I think the real challenge for most businesses is to just accept and acknowledge that some marketing is immeasurable. You just can't measure it. You can't predict it. It will always have some level of uncertainty to it because of the artistic side of it. And those who are purely focused on the artistic side and say it's not a science at all basically don't understand that there are patterns and that there are behaviors that we can actually predict with some level of certainty that can help us apply and optimize what we're trying to optimize for the business, which is creating wealth for the business. And so it's a constant balance that you have to sort of say, yes, we are going to look at the science of looking at optimizing a business function, but we're going to acknowledge that some of that is artistic and creative in nature and is unpredictable. A lot of of companies, whether it be Meta, whether it be Google, whether it be Amazon, Microsoft, OpenAI to a certain extent, and even down to some of the more enterprise level products, where it's this new innovation called artificial intelligence, but they're making the innovation the hero of the story rather than the consumer or the user of the actual product. And it's a classic marketing mistake that happens, but it's interesting that it's happening in 2024 with so much information about what good marketing looks like these days out there. It's a little surprising that they're doing such a ham-fisted job at this, which is trying to make people feel like they have to be worthy of the technology rather than than us being sort of the hero of the story and using the technology to become the heroes of our own story. And that ad is just a perfect example of that, which is the solutionism part of that is that the solutionism idea is that everything is a problem to be solved. And it gets very, very common in startup world and Silicon Valley and everything, where everything becomes a problem that you have to solve. And so we have to solve it with technology. And creativity is just not a problem that needs to be solved. Having a young girl write a fan letter to one of her favorite Olympians is not a problem that needs to be solved. Certainly it doesn't need to be solved by artificial intelligence. And so when you start looking at it that way, you say, why are they not reading the room? Like, why are they not taking the time to actually understand where we as consumers of this product see the value of artificial intelligence, where we're uncertain, where we're fearful, and where we're actually trepidatious about this new innovation, and helping us come along and sell that rather than sort of saying, we have this godlike power and you need to feel worthy of that. And if you don't, you're going to be out of a job. It's very hard for me to reconcile the sort of logic of that messaging that they're taking. There are two categories of content, and this comes from a critique of this. This will show my background in English lit and writing and stuff. It actually comes from a critique that G.K. Chesterton wrote about Dickens when he was writing Tale of Two Cities. And he talked about two different kinds of content. And he said there is created content. And created content is content that is loved before it is ever expressed. In other words, these are ideas that are loved by the author before they ever exist. So think about every novel that has been written, or a poem, or a piece of music, or it's loved in the artist, the writer, the creator's head before it ever exists. The second category is constructed content. That is content that can only be loved after it has been expressed. In other words, it can be great, amazing, impactful, valuable content, but it's really only loved after it's expressed. So think of the user manual of a product, or think of a stop sign, or the law, or expressing all of those things. That's content that can only be loved after it's been completed, it's constructed. And so for me, AI is an amazing tool to help me construct constructed content. In other words, I have an idea, I start to express it, and I need something to construct, an abstract to the webinar, an abstract to my book, a summary of my meeting that I had with a client. That's a fantastic use case for me for AI, because it saves me time, it helps me normalize and sort of organize my thoughts. It recognizes the patterns in my thinking and can pull those patterns out. It's not helpful at all for me in coming up with ideas that I love and want to express myself.